The warmest she ever slept that entire winter was on a night when the temperature outside dropped to 41 below zero. Not because she had more firewood than the neighbours, she had less by a lot. Not because her cabin was better built. It wasn't even a cabin by anyone's definition. It was a single room with dirt walls, a fireplace she'd mortared herself with wet clay and river gravel, and a sleeping platform that sat directly over a narrow trench she'd dug by hand into the frozen earth. The trench ran from the firebox to the far wall, maybe 11 feet. It was 9 inches wide and 14 inches deep, lined with flat sandstone she'd dragged up from the creek bed one piece at a time, while her 2 daughters watched from the doorway. Her neighbours thought it was one of the stranger things they'd seen a person do. That was in the winter of 1891 in Perkins County, South Dakota, one of the coldest counties in a territory that was already notorious for cold. The thermometer in Bison that January registered 41 degrees Fahrenheit on the 17th. A rancher named Gust Tollefson lost 63 head of cattle in a single night, 2 miles east of where she was sleeping, on that same date, over that same trench, warm enough that she'd pushed her wool blanket down to her waist. Her name was Agnes Pelletier. She was 34 years old. She had 2 daughters, Ruth, who was 9, and Clara, who was 6, and she had been given, by her late husband's brothers, the worst piece of property they controlled, not the worst they owned, the worst they had any connection to at all. A dugout with a partial roof collapse on a creek flat that flooded every spring and froze first every fall. The brothers took the house in Bison. They took the 3 good milk cows, the draft horse, the cast-iron favourite stove, and the 2 remaining cords of split oak stacked against the north wall. They left her a mule with a bad front leg, 60 pounds of cornmeal, and the creek property. She had maybe 8 weeks before winter. And what she built during those 8 weeks, working mostly alone, sometimes with Ruth pulling rope, is one of the most interesting pieces of low-technology heating engineering I've come across from the whole Plains settlement period. It borrowed from something the Koreans had been doing for 3,000 years. She almost certainly didn't know that. Here is the thing about heat that most people in 1891 didn't understand, and honestly most people today still don't think about clearly. When you light a fire in a standard iron stove, the stove heats the air. Hot air rises. It pools at the ceiling where you are not. The floor stays cold. Your feet stay cold. Your body is constantly losing heat downward through the floor by conduction, and upward through cold air that keeps pulling warmth off your skin. You burn a cord of wood, and most of what you paid for goes straight up the chimney or sits uselessly 12 inches above your head. The open fireplace that Agnes inherited was even worse. A standard frontier fireplace of that era sent roughly 85% of its heat directly up the flue. What radiated out into the room came off the front face of the firebox, a rectangle, maybe 24 inches wide and 18 inches tall. At 6 feet away, you felt it. At 10 feet, you felt almost nothing. The back wall of a 12-foot room might as well have been outdoors. Agnes didn't know the term radiant heat in any formal sense, but she understood something real about how heat moves, because she'd grown up watching her grandmother cook on a completely different kind of hearth, a low, wide masonry platform with a covered cooking cavity and a sleeping bench built against its side wall. Her grandmother's family had come from the Lorraine region of France, where that style of stove had been common for 2 centuries. The bench got warm. If you slept on it, you stayed warm. The air in the room could be cold enough to see your breath, and the people sleeping on the bench were comfortable. What her grandmother's hearth was doing without anyone calling it this was delivering radiant heat directly to the body rather than warming the air around the body. The physics behind those 2 things are completely different, and the difference in fuel efficiency is staggering. Agnes arrived at the creek property in late September 1891 with her daughters, the lame mule, 60 pounds of cornmeal, and a wagon bed she'd taken apart and used as roofing material over the existing dugout. The partial collapse on the east side had been caused by a rotten cottonwood roof pole. She replaced it with wagon bed planks, packed sod over the top, and had a weatherproof room by the first week of October, 11 feet wide, 14 feet deep, ceiling just under 6 feet, which meant she could stand upright, but only barely, and the girls had to watch their heads around the low doorframe. The fireplace was the original feature of the dugout. Whoever had built the place before her, a bachelor homesteader who'd abandoned the claim in 1888 after the Great Blizzard had mortared river stones into the north wall and run a clay-lined flue straight up, through the sod roof. It drew reasonably well. The firebox opening was about 20 inches across and 18 inches high. Not large, not efficient. But it existed, and it was hers. Her fuel problem was immediate and serious. The creek bottom had cottonwood soft, wet, half-rotted stuff that burned fast and gave off little heat per pound. The nearest good hardwood was 22 miles east, and she had no way to haul it. Cow chips from the previous summer's grazing were available if she walked the draws, but not in any quantity that would carry her through a full winter. She had maybe the equivalent of 1 cord of marginal fuel if she spent every dry afternoon collecting. A standard heated dugout that size needed 3 cords minimum to stay alive through a Perkins County winter. She couldn't afford to heat air, she had to heat herself. The idea came to her while she was watching the fire one evening in early October. She noticed that the hearthstone, a flat piece of pink quartzite she'd set as a floor-level base for the firebox, was still warm 2 hours after she'd let the fire go out. Not hot, warm. She held her palm against it, and it was absolutely, clearly warmer than the dirt floor 18 inches away. That quartzite slab was maybe 2 inches thick and 18 inches square. It had absorbed heat from the fire, and it was giving it back slowly, long after the flames were gone. She thought about that for a while. Then she went outside with a mattock. What Agnes did over the next 3 weeks wasn't architecturally complex. It was physical. And it was methodical in a way that suggests she thought it through carefully before she touched a tool. She dug a trench from the base of the firebox, starting right at the hearthstone, running along the north wall, and then angling south toward her sleeping platform, which she had not built yet. The trench was 9 inches wide and 14 inches deep. The soil in the creek flat was silty clay, which is hard to dig but holds its shape well once cut. She worked at it 2 to 3 hours per day when the girls were occupied, sometimes longer. The sandstone she needed for lining came from the creek bed, where flat slabs had broken off a shelf exposure and been tumbled smooth. She loaded them into the wagon one at a time. Each piece weighed between 20 and 50 pounds. She made 11 trips over 4 days. Ruth helped pull the mule. She set the sandstone slabs into the trench floor first, then stood smaller pieces on edge to line the walls, fitting them together tight. At the firebox end, she left a gap in the base of the rear firebox wall about 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall, so that combustion gases from the fire, instead of all going straight up the flue, had a second path, a low path, one that ran under the hearthstone and into the trench. She didn't want smoke in the room. So she took the trench all the way to the far wall of the dugout, where she'd cut a small vertical opening through the sod, to the outside a secondary flue, essentially, made from 2 upright stone slabs and a flat cap. It drew by the same principle as any chimney. Hot gases rise, creating draft. The path from the firebox base, through the trench, and out the far vent was a complete circuit. Gases went in at the firebox, travelled through the stone-lined channel, gave up heat to the stone along the way, and exited through the secondary vent. She covered the trench with more sandstone slabs, bedded in clay, levelled them flush with the dugout floor, then built her sleeping platform, a frame of cottonwood poles with a woven willow rod surface directly over the covered trench. The platform sat maybe 8 inches above the floor. The trench ran directly beneath it. That was it. That was the whole system. The physics of what she built is worth understanding clearly, because it's genuinely not obvious until you think about it. Heat moves in three ways. Conduction, which is direct contact between materials. Convection, which is heat carried by moving air or fluid. And radiation, which is electromagnetic energy traveling through space the same way sunlight warms you, even in freezing air. A standard iron stove or fireplace heats a room almost entirely by convection. It warms air, air moves around, eventually the room gets warmer. But here's the problem with that. Air stratifies. Hot air rises. The warmest layer in a convectively heated room sits right under the ceiling 6 or 7 feet up, and the coldest layer sits at the floor. You can have 72 degrees Fahrenheit at head height and 52 degrees Fahrenheit at your feet in the same room with the same fire going. That cold layer at the floor is where you sleep. That cold layer is also where small children spend most of their time. Radiant heat doesn't do this. It travels in a straight line from a warm surface to whatever surface it hits. A hot stone floor radiates heat directly upward, directly into any body lying on or near it without warming the air in between at all. Your body lying on a warm surface receives that radiant energy on your underside, which is the side that would otherwise be losing heat by conduction to the cold ground. Here's what that means practically. A sleeping person is generating about 250 British thermal units per hour of body heat. On a cold floor in a cold room, they're losing most of that to the floor by conduction and to the cold air by convection. They need external heat input just to stay comfortable, and it has to be substantial. But a sleeping person lying on a surface that's even mildly warm, say 85 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, is not losing heat downward at all. The net conduction goes the other direction. They only need to maintain warmth against airside losses, which are lower because they're under a blanket. The fuel requirement drops dramatically. The stone slabs covering Agnes's trench sandstone, which has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.71 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Celsius, were absorbing heat from the gases passing below them, holding it, and then radiating it slowly upward into the sleeping platform. The temperature of those stones when the fire had been burning for 2 hours would have been somewhere between 90 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit at the trench surface. That's not hot enough to burn. It's warm enough to sleep on comfortably, and it stays warm for hours after the fire goes out. She was firing the trench once in the evening, usually for about 90 minutes to 2 hours. By the time the girls went to sleep, the stones were warm. They stayed warm, not hot, warm until well past midnight. The air in the room might drop to 45 degrees Fahrenheit by morning. But on the platform, with the stone radiating from below and a wool blanket above, the girls slept through it. What she'd built without knowing its name, without knowing its history, was a version of what the Koreans called the Ondol. The Ondol, the name comes from 2 Korean characters meaning warm and stone, is one of the oldest continuously used domestic heating systems on the planet. Archaeological evidence puts its earliest form at sites in what is now northeastern Korea, dating to somewhere around 1000 BC. That's 3,000 years of refinement before Agnes Pelletier ever picked up a mattock in Perkins County. The traditional Ondol works by routing hot combustion gases through horizontal channels beneath a stone floor. The kitchen fire, or a dedicated heating firebox, sends gases through a narrow throat called a bulmock, then into a network of channels running under flat granite slabs, and eventually out through a chimney on the far wall. The stone floor absorbs the heat from those gases. It radiates that heat slowly and steadily upward into the room and into the bodies sleeping on it. Koreans historically slept on mats directly on the Ondol floor, which in a well-fired house might be 80 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit and kept the room air quite cold. The heat went where the people were, not where people weren't. By the 16th century, during a period of intense cold across East Asia, the system had become universal in Korean houses. What had started as a heating method for the sleeping area had expanded to cover entire floors. The physics that made it work radiant heat from a stored heat mass delivered directly to occupants was so efficient that a Korean household could stay comfortable through winters that averaged below 10 degrees Fahrenheit by firing the Ondol maybe twice a day on relatively modest amounts of wood or rice. Strav. The critical number is this. Measured surface temperatures on a traditional Ondol floor run between 27 and 38.8 degrees Celsius. That's 80 to 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Modern engineering studies comparing radiant floor systems to convective forced air systems consistently find that radiant delivers equal thermal comfort at 15 to 30% lower energy consumption. The reason is exactly what Agnes discovered by watching her hearthstone stay warm long after the fire went out. You're not paying to heat the air nobody is standing in. You're paying to heat the surfaces people actually touch. Agnes got to the same answer from a different direction. She didn't come from Korea. She came from Missouri, via a grandmother who'd come from Lorraine, who'd slept on a warm masonry bench next to a wood-fired stove and thought nothing of it because it was simply the way things were done. She saw the hearthstone stay warm. She thought about what would happen if she extended that warmth under the place she slept. She dug the trench. The first hard test came in November. A fast-moving cold front crossed Perkins County on the 19th of November, 1891, dropping the temperature from 34 degrees Fahrenheit at midday to -9 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. It wasn't the worst weather she'd see that winter, but it was the first genuine cold, and it came with wind, a northwest wind running maybe 25 miles an hour, which put the felt temperature somewhere around 30 degrees Fahrenheit against anything exposed. Agnes had her trench operating by this point. She'd been running it experimentally through October, learning how the system behaved. She'd made one adjustment. She'd added a damper to the secondary vent. Fashioned from a flat stone, she could slide across the opening with a stick. When the trench was warm enough, she slid the stone partly across the vent to slow the draft and keep more heat in the channel longer. It worked imperfectly. The drawer would sometimes back up and push a little smoke into the room, but she figured out the balance within a few weeks. Leave it a quarter open. Enough draft to pull, not enough to rush the heat through before the stone could absorb it. November 19th, she fired the trench around 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the cold arrived. By the time she noticed the wind had turned brutal, the stones under the sleeping platform had been absorbing heat for close to 3 hours. She let the fire die down to coals and slid the vent stone to a quarter open. Went to sleep. She noted in a letter to her sister in Jefferson City, a letter that survived because the sister kept it, and it eventually ended up in the South Dakota State Archives in Pierre, that she woke sometime in the night when Clara crawled closer to her for warmth, and she realized the platform was still warm under her hip. She pressed her hand down, and the stone surface was easily 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The room air, when she got up to check on the mule, was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to be uncomfortable, not cold enough to be dangerous. She went back to sleep. Her neighbor's situation that same night was different. A man named Harold Driscoll had homesteaded a quarter section about 1.5 miles northwest. He had a proper lumber-framed cabin with a good cast-iron stove, a Beckwith Monarch, which was a reasonable stove for the period, rated at about 35,000 British thermal units per hour at full load. He had 3 cords of cottonwood split and stacked. By November 19th, he'd already burned through nearly half a cord just in the first cold weeks of the month. The stove heated the air in his cabin reasonably well while it burned. When he banked it for sleep, the air cooled fast. Cottonwood doesn't hold coals long, and by 3 in the morning his water bucket had a skim of ice on it. Driscoll was not suffering. He was fine. But he was also burning wood at a rate that, extended, would leave him short by February. Agnes was burning much less. She estimated again in the letters that her fuel consumption was roughly a third of what she'd expected based on her experience in Missouri. A fire that ran for 2 hours in the evening, maybe an hour at midday when it was very cold, and a small morning fire to warm the trench again before the girls got up. The stone held heat. She wasn't heating the air above the sleeping platform to any great degree. She was heating the stone, and the stone was heating the people, and the people stayed warm all night on fuel she burned before they went to sleep. The community reaction to the trench was not sympathetic. Perkins County in 1891 had a loose social web settlers spread over a large territory, occasional gatherings at the Bison Township Meeting Hall, trading and gossip at the general store run by a man named Otto Haverfield. Agnes came into Bison twice in October to trade work for supplies, and both times she described what she was building to people who asked how she was managing the cold. The response was laughter, mostly. Not cruel laughter, the amused, head-shaking kind that comes from people who think someone has made a fundamental error in reasoning. Haverfield told her flat out that a trench under a sleeping platform was going to fill the dugout with smoke and asphyxiate her daughters. He wasn't wrong that this was a risk. He was wrong that she hadn't thought about it, and wrong that the secondary vent didn't solve it. A woman named Gertrude Scholl, whose husband ran cattle on a large spread to the south, made the observation in front of several other women. At the store that sleeping over a coal trench sounded like something an animal would do. That comment went around. By November, people were referring to Agnes's place, when they referred to it at all, as the mole hole. The thing about the mockery that Agnes herself described with some precision in her letters was this: everyone who laughed had more resources than she did. Haverfield had a good stove. The Scholls had a proper house with 2 heating stoves and a hired man to keep them fed. The other settlers with lumber cabins and full wood piles had nothing to lose by doing things the standard way. Agnes had no room for the standard way. The standard way would have left her short on fuel by January, with 2 children and a lame mule, and no one who had offered to help. She didn't argue with them. She went back to the creek flat and kept working on the trench. What she was doing with the trench channeling hot combustion gas through stone to store and then radiate heat was not, in the physics, different from what the Romans had been doing under their bath floors 17 centuries earlier. The Roman Hypocaust, the word, comes from Greek, meaning burned from below, worked by routing furnace gases under a raised tile floor supported on short brick columns called pilae. The gases heated the floor from below. The floor radiated heat into the room from above. Roman engineers extended this to wall systems as well, with hollow ceramic tiles letting heat travel up through the walls themselves. Archaeological reconstructions have measured the furnace temperatures in Roman bath hypocausts at 330 to 410 degrees Celsius. That's 625 to 770 degrees Fahrenheit at the combustion end, with floor surface temperatures reaching 58 degrees Celsius near the furnace and dropping to around 24 degrees Celsius at the far end of the room. Agnes's system ran cooler than that. The gap at the base of her firebox wasn't capturing superheated furnace gas, it was capturing the lower, slower movement of hot air near the base of the fire, which was probably in the 300 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit range by the time it entered the trench. Over 11 feet of stone-lined channel, that gas gave up most of its heat to the sandstone and exited the far vent at something much closer to ambient temperature, which is exactly what you want. Heat that exits the secondary vent is heat you didn't get to use. The longer the path, the more heat you recover before it leaves. This is what made the Ondol channels efficient enough to warm a Korean floor to 85 degrees Fahrenheit on twice-daily firings of rice straw. This is what made Roman bath floors warm enough to require wooden sandals. And this is what made Agnes's sleeping platform warm enough to sleep comfortably on a night when it was 41 degrees Fahrenheit outside in Bison. The Chinese Kang, a heated sleeping platform used across northern China and Manchuria, with archaeological roots going back somewhere around 7,200 years at sites in what is now Liaoning province, operated on exactly the same principle in a slightly different configuration. Instead of floor channels, the Kang ran combustion gases through a hollow masonry platform roughly 6 to 8 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 18 to 20 inches tall. Cooking smoke from breakfast would pass through the platform's interior before exiting through a chimney, and the platform surface, brick or adobe, would absorb that heat and hold it at 80 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit for hours afterward. In northern China, where winter air temperatures could reach 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 66 million Kangs were in use as recently as 2009. Serving something like 175 million people who slept comfortably on their surfaces through winters that would have killed anyone trying to heat that same volume of air to the same comfort level. Agnes Pelletier didn't know about the Kang. She didn't know about the Ondol. She knew about her grandmother's sleep bench next to a Lorraine hearth, and she knew what the hearthstone felt like 2 hours after the fire went out, and she started digging. The physics didn't care where she learned it. January 1892 was the worst month of that winter. A cold front settled over the northern plains on January 14th and barely moved for 12 days. Bison registered 41 degrees Fahrenheit on the 17th, the reading that killed Gust Tollefson's cattle. Temperatures stayed below zero continuously from January 14th through January 26th. The creek flat where Agnes's dugout sat froze solid to a depth of nearly 4 feet. The secondary vent on the far wall froze over twice, and she had to clear it with a length of wire she'd saved from a broken fence. During this period she fired the trench 3 times a day, morning, midday, and evening. Each firing was about 90 minutes of cottonwood and dried cow chips. A mixed burn that she'd worked out gave a longer, steadier heat output than either fuel alone. The stones took about 40 minutes to reach their working temperature and held it for 4 to 5 hours afterward. The sleeping platform surface, when she pressed her hand to it just before the girls went to bed, it was warm enough that you had to count to 5 before it became uncomfortable, roughly 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit at the peak, dropping to 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit by early morning. The room air sat between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit for most of January, cold enough that they wore their coats inside. The mule, which she'd brought into the dugout's small anteroom that she'd dug out behind the entrance, kept the entry area a few degrees warmer. Water stayed liquid in the bucket near the fireplace, but froze overnight in anything left near the north wall. They were not comfortable in the way that a well-heated house is comfortable, but they were alive, and they were warm enough, on fuel that she estimated at under half a cord for the entire month. Harold Driscoll burned through his last cord on January 20th and spent the final week of the cold snap burning furniture, a chair, a crate, eventually a table leg to keep his stove going. He was in no danger of dying. But when the cold broke on January 26th, he made the ride to Bison to buy more wood and paid $4 a cord for cottonwood, which was all Haverfield had. He stopped at Agnes's dugout on the way home. He didn't say much, by her account. He looked at the sleeping platform, asked her to show him the trench opening at the firebox base, looked at the secondary vent on the far wall. She showed him all of it. He nodded, asked how long the stones stayed warm after she stopped firing. 4 hours, she told him. Sometimes 5, if she'd run a long afternoon burn. He nodded again, bought his wood from Haverfield, went home. 2 weeks later, this is still in her letters, he came back and asked if she'd help him lay a similar channel under the sleeping area in his cabin. He'd pulled up the floorboards on the east side. He brought his own sandstone in a wagon. She spent 2 days helping him build it. She did not say anything about the mole hole comment. He didn't bring it up either. The thing that separated Agnes's situation from her neighbours wasn't cleverness exactly. It was constraint. People with adequate resources don't have to solve hard problems. Harold Driscoll had a good stove and 3 cords of wood, and there was no reason for him to think differently about heat until he ran out of wood in January and suddenly had a reason. Agnes ran out of margin before the cold even started. She had to find a different answer before the problem was already on her. This is a pattern that shows up across the history of thermal engineering. The Koreans didn't develop the Ondol in warm weather. They developed it because northeastern Korea gets to -40 degrees Fahrenheit in January, and rice straw is not a fuel you can afford to waste. The Roman Hypocaust wasn't invented for comfort. It was engineered because Roman bath culture required specific temperatures in specific rooms, and wood in the Roman Mediterranean was already becoming scarce by the 1st century BC. Fuel scarcity plus precise thermal requirements produces creative solutions. Agnes Pelletier had both. What she did with the trench also had a specific and correct understanding of something that most frontier settlers got backwards. The goal of a heating system isn't to make the air warm. The air is not what freezes. The air is not what you're trying to keep alive. Your body is what matters, and your body loses heat to cold surfaces by conduction, to cold air by convection, and to cold surfaces across space by radiation. If you can address all three simultaneously, which a warm sleeping surface does, because it eliminates conductive loss, reduces the temperature differential driving convective loss, and provides radiant heat from below, you need far less total energy than if you're trying to heat the entire air volume of the room to a comfortable temperature. Modern radiant floor heating studies confirm this in numbers. The U.S. Department of Energy estimates that radiant floor systems typically run 15 to 30% more efficiently than forced air systems for the same level of thermal comfort. The reason is stratification. In a forced air or convective system, the temperature differential between floor and ceiling in a standard 8-foot room is roughly 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. You're burning fuel to heat a ceiling layer that provides no comfort to anyone. In a radiant floor system, that differential essentially disappears. The floor is warm, the ceiling is cool, and all the heat is where the people are. Agnes's trench was delivering maybe 10 to 15% of its heat to the room air and 85 to 90% directly to the sleeping surface. A cast-iron stove in the same room would have inverted those numbers, with most of the heat going to the air, most of the hot air going to the ceiling, and most of the ceiling heat going to the cold sod roof above it. She was heating people. Everyone else was heating rooms. She stayed at the creek property through 3 more winters. The trench got modified in the 2nd year. She extended it, added a branch that ran under a second sleeping area she'd built for the girls on the opposite side of the dugout, about 6 feet long with its own sandstone cover. She had to add a secondary vent to maintain draft. That winter she fired the system twice a day and kept both sleeping areas at workable temperatures through conditions that included a February cold snap that held the county below -20 degrees Fahrenheit for 9 consecutive days. She also, in the winter of 1892, showed the system to a woman named Ida Conrad, whose husband had died of typhoid that August, leaving her with 4 children and a sod house that had been inadequately built, thin walls, a poor stove. Agnes spent a weekend at Ida's place with a wagon load of sandstone and helped her dig a shorter version of the channel 8 feet, running under a combined sleeping platform for all 4 children. They built it without a secondary vent initially, just with the existing stovepipe, creating a natural draft through the firebox gap, and had to add the vent later when they found the smoke path wasn't reliable. But it worked. Ida Conrad's children slept warm through that winter on fuel she collected from the drawers. When Agnes finally left the creek property, she filed on a better claim in Corson County in 1894, and sold the Perkins County place for $140 to a family named Bauer. She described the trench system in a letter to her sister with a tone that was neither proud nor apologetic. She said she'd built the only thing that made sense given what she had, and she couldn't understand why more people didn't do something similar. "The stone stays warm," she wrote. "The air doesn't have to." What Agnes built in 1891 had precedent on a scale she would never have imagined. The Ondol tradition in Korea. The smoke channel floor heating she independently invented a version of was recognized by UNESCO in 2015 as an element of Korea's intangible cultural heritage. By the time Agnes was digging her trench in South Dakota, Korean families had been sleeping over warm stone channels for somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years. The system had survived every dynasty, every invasion, every economic disruption, because it worked too well to abandon. Even when coal replaced wood and propane replaced coal and hot water pipes replaced combustion channels, Koreans kept the principle underfloor radiant heat and simply updated the mechanism. Modern Korean apartments run hydronic Ondol as standard. The floor is warm. The people are warm. The air above head height is whatever temperature it is. The same physics had been rediscovered by every cold climate culture that sat still long enough to need it. The Roman Hypocaust, the Chinese Kang, the medieval Scandinavian Hypocaustum, which was a simplified version of the Roman system using a heated stone mass in a subfloor cavity. The Aleutian semi-subterranean houses at Unalaska, excavated by archaeologist Richard Knecht in 2014, showed stone-lined underfloor heat channels dating to roughly 1000 BC, which may be an independent invention of the same principle or may reflect very old trans-Pacific contact, and nobody is certain which. What is certain is that people who lived in cold places and had access to stone and fire kept arriving at the same answer. The Americans didn't, not the settlers anyway. The cast iron stove became the dominant technology and stayed dominant, and it was good enough. Good enough if you had adequate fuel, a well-built structure, and the money to maintain both. Agnes had none of those things. So she arrived at the same answer the Koreans and the Romans and the Chinese had arrived at, from a different direction, in a South Dakota creek flat in the fall of 1891. Frank Lloyd Wright, who is the person usually credited with introducing radiant floor heating to American architecture, didn't encounter the Ondol principle until 1914. When he stayed with a Japanese host during construction of the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo and noticed that the floor of his room was warm, he wrote about it. He started incorporating radiant floor heating into his Usonian house designs in the 1930s. Those designs' modest houses, meant to be affordable by middle-class families, built with concrete slab floors heated by hot water pipes, are now cited in architecture textbooks as visionary. Agnes Pelletier was doing it in dirt and sandstone in 1891. Nobody wrote about her. Nobody was going to. She was a widow on a creek flat in Perkins County who built what she had to build to keep her daughters warm, and then she left when she could afford to. And the Bowers who bought the property probably pulled up the sandstone covers and used them for something else. The physics didn't change. The stone stays warm. The air doesn't have to. There's a number worth keeping in mind. A human body at rest generates about 250 British thermal units per hour of heat. That's not much. A single candle produces roughly 80 British thermal units per hour, so a resting person is about 3 candles worth of heat output. In a cold environment, the body is constantly trying to maintain its core temperature at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit against everything around it that is colder. The rate of heat loss depends on the temperature of the surrounding surfaces and air, and on whether the body is in contact with those surfaces. Conductive heat loss through contact with a cold floor is fast and significant. A body lying on a surface that's 30 degrees Fahrenheit colder than skin temperature loses heat roughly 40 times faster than it would to still air at the same temperature difference. That's why sleeping on cold ground is so much more dangerous than standing in cold air. Contact matters. Agnes's trench eliminated that. The sandstone surface of her sleeping platform was above body temperature, or close to it, for the first several hours of the night. Heat was flowing from the stone into the body, not from the body into the stone. At that point, her daughters weren't fighting to maintain 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit against a heat sink below them. They were receiving heat from below, insulated from cold air above by a wool blanket, and their metabolic load dropped accordingly. They slept. Gus Tollefson's cattle, 63 of them, dead by morning on January 17th, had no such advantage. They were standing on frozen ground, losing heat through their hooves by conduction at a rate the rest of their body couldn't compensate for. The internal temperature of the animal drops from the extremities inward. The process is not dramatic. It is simply cold taking what cold takes when nothing stands between an animal and the frozen earth. Agnes had built the thing that stood between. The letter she wrote to her sister on the 3rd of February 1892, about 2 weeks after the January cold snap broke, is the clearest description of how she understood what she'd built. She wrote it in French, which was the language she and her sister used when they didn't want anyone to read over their shoulder. A translator working for the South Dakota Historical Society produced an English version in 1974. She described the trench in practical terms: how long it took to heat, how long it held, how she adjusted the vent stone. Then she wrote something that I find genuinely striking, considering she was describing a heating system she'd invented out of desperation with a mattock and stolen sandstone in a creek flat. She wrote, roughly, "The air forgets. I light the fire and the air gets warm, and then when the fire goes out, the air goes back to what it was. But the stone remembers. You put heat into stone and the stone keeps it. You can go to sleep and the stone is still giving back what you gave it 3 hours ago. The air is the wrong thing to trust." She had no physics education. She was describing, in a letter to her sister in Jefferson City, the concept of specific heat capacity, the measure of how much thermal energy a material can store per unit mass and thermal mass, and the way dense materials act as thermal buffers against fluctuating temperatures. She just described it as the stone remembering. She was not wrong. Sandstone has a specific heat of roughly 0.71 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Celsius. The sandstone she used flat creek slabs, maybe 40 to 60 kilograms total, covering the trench surface could store somewhere around 1,700 to 2,500 kilojoules of thermal energy in a 2-hour firing. That's about the energy content of 2/3 of a pound of dry wood, stored in the stone and released over 4 to 5 hours rather than in the 20 minutes it would take to just burn that wood in an open fire. The stone was doing something no fire can do on its own, spreading the heat release out over time, into the night, into sleep, into a child's body, on a January morning in South Dakota when it was 40 below outside. The air forgets. The stone remembers. Agnes Pelletier left Perkins County in the spring of 1894. She took her daughters, the mule who had recovered well enough from the leg injury to work reliably for another 3 years, and $140 from the Bauer family. She filed on 160 acres in Corson County and built a proper sod house with a better fireplace and a winter kitchen. She did not build another trench system in Corson County. She had more fuel there, more resources, more neighbors. She didn't need to. But Ida Conrad's children slept warm. Harold Driscoll burned half the wood he'd burned the year before. And somewhere in Perkins County, under whatever the Bowers eventually built or didn't build on that creek flat, there are still sandstone slabs in a clay-lined channel running from the base of an old fireplace to a far wall that no longer exists. The stone remembers.